Name of my talk is Bigamy and the Creole Beauty, Race and Anxiety in Dr. Wortle's School, 1881. Trollope's late novel, Dr. Wortle's School, has always been recognized as a fine work. One of Trollope's best short novels, as John Hall states in his biography. Like earlier 1869 novel, he knew he was right. Dr. Wortle's School focuses upon a troubled marriage, this time a bigamous but loving union. The story centers around the Reverend Dr. Wortle, whose elite school prepares the young sons of the upper classes for Eton. He hires an Oxford-educated classics teacher, Mr. Henry Peacock, a repatriated Englishman who arrives from the United States with his darkly beautiful American wife, Ella. It turns out that the Peacocks married in good faith, but that Mrs. Peacock's first husband, Ferdinand Lefroy, the vicious son of a ruined Louisiana planter, is still alive and shows up on their St. Louis doorstep after their marriage. Instead of separating, the Peacocks flee together to England and work at Bowick School until their suspicious reclusiveness and Lefroy's brother Robert's appearance in England compel them to divulge their secret. Scholars have historically focused upon Bowick Parish's horrified response to the discovery of bigamy in their midst, in tension with the more flexible and tolerant morality of the hero, Dr. Geoffrey Wortle, who inquires into the particulars of the case and decides to champion the beleaguered husband and wife. Gordon Ray argued in his classic essay, Trollope at Full Length, that Dr. Wortle's School, written in the aftermath of Trollope's dear friend George Henry Lewis's death, was an homage and apologia for Lewis's unsanctioned union with George Eliot, who was also close to Trollope. Scholarly arguments about the novel since Ray have tended to extend the controversy about whether Trollope is calling for a more relative morality, as Robert Polhemus declares in The Changing World of Anthony Trollope, or whether Trollope is portraying the difficult struggles of a principled and generous hero who is, nevertheless, supporting an unacceptable flouting of the laws of God and society with which Trollope does not agree, as Robert Tracy states in Trollope's later novels. Much more recently, Mick Imlaw's suggestion that Trollope's young American friend Kate Field influenced the novel is one of the only new views of the novel that has been proposed about Dr. Wortle's School for quite some time. I hope to stir things up a bit with this lecture's argument, which I first proposed in my book Reforming Trollope, Race, Gender, and Englishness in the Novels of Anthony Trollope, and now present in a reconsidered form. The energies of Trollope's novel are not, I want to argue, primarily generated by the shock of bigamy, and certainly not its attendant sensational treatment, as in 1860s novels such as Mary Elizabeth Braddon's Lady Audley's Secret or Mrs. Henry Wood's East Lynne. Instead, Dr. Wortle's School engages race and colonial issues that are masked by the bigamy plot, which displaces racial fears with more recognizable sanctions. Elements pointing to the negotiation of race are not mentioned in critiques of Dr. Wortle's School, including the extreme brownness of Ella Peacock's coloring, Ella's origin and that of the former Confederate officer, the Lefroys, in the ruined planter class of post-Civil War Louisiana, and Ella's virtual imprisonment in an English school for the majority of the novel. In Dr. Wortle's School, Trollope is negotiating Englishness through his entry into continuing transatlantic discourse about race and the legacy of enslavement. Trollope is insisting that English identity must include a confrontation with England's history of enslavement in the British West Indies and its involvement in the slave trade that furnished the plantations of the American South. He writes that history in the figure of the Creole woman who elicits race anxiety focused on miscegenation. As Jennifer DeVere Brody argues in Impossible Purities, the woman of color, who can be designated alternatively as a mulatta, an octoroon, a quadroon, or Creole, is a highly ambiguous figure. The infractions of blood that govern her constitution occlude more than they reveal. Her complicated constitution both marked and masked the 19th century misalliance known as miscegenation. I propose that Trollope is writing about the Peacock's bigamous marriage and its perceived menace to the English community, as it codes the more frightening possibility of mixed race marriage and racial contamination. Trollope examines what Laura Chokowski calls in another context the dangers to English cultural identity that are introduced by a degenerate past. Race and colonial discourses inflect Trollope's realist domestic fictions in the decade after the emancipation of the slaves in the United States and decades after British colonial slavery was officially ended in the 1830s. The Jamaica Rebellion in 1865 and its brutal repression by Governor Eyre, with the resultant controversy in England through the late 1860s and early 1870s, strongly influenced Trollope's fiction. The missionary explorer David Livingstone had famously alerted the English public to the outrages of Arab slavery in Africa through his last journal, published in England posthumously in 1874. If Trollope followed his usual course of pondering his characters for a long while before setting pen to paper, Dr. Wortle's school could well have been germinating for a decade before the 3-week period in April 1879 in which he wrote the novel while staying at his friend Lucas Collins' rectory in Northamptonshire. It was called, by the way, Bowick Rectory, and one of the early titles of the novel was The Bowick School, which you might find interesting because he changed it to Dr. Wortle's School. Trollope's travels through South Africa from June through December 1877 seem to have been another turning point for him in terms of his thinking about race and empire. When he returned from South Africa in January of 1878, he wrote, as Trollope's biographer John Hall states, his most discerning travel work. His thinking is more subtle, more progressive, more amenable to change, and certainly less prejudiced in regard to the native races. Trollope here was far less John Bullish than most of his countrymen. In South Africa, published in 1878, a little over a year before he wrote Dr. Wortle's School, Trollope rejected the idea of South Africa as a colony to be gradually inhabited by Englishmen. He thought that South Africa should continue to be inhabited by Black Africans who would eventually be educated to the point of self-rule. As Trollope was completing Dr. Wortle's School, he wrote a letter on April 26, 1879, to his friend, the English-born Australian historian G.W. Rusden, famous defender of the Maoris in New Zealand, in which Trollope criticized Sir Henry Bartle Frere, High Commissioner for South Africa, for his launching of the Anglo-Zulu War, which was in its 3rd month during the writing of Dr. Wortle's School. And here's what he said. Frere has waged war against those unfortunates who, having lived side by side with us in Natal for 25 years without ever having raised a hand against us, the consequence is that we have already slaughtered 10,000 of them and rejoice in having done so. To me, it seems like civilization gone mad. Not only was Trollope thinking through a more liberal stance on race in South Africa, he was also writing about the colonies in two novels published about the same time, An Eye for an Eye, set in Ireland, which he'd actually written in 1870, set aside in the way he did sometimes, and then finished in 1879 and published, just the same time almost as Dr. Wortle's School. And the second novel's John Caldigate, set partly in Australia, which Trollope completed on board ship to South Africa. Trollope explored the issue of bigamy in John Caldigate, inflected with white colonial Australia's singular criminal and gold rush histories. In Dr. Wortle's School, Trollope thinks about bigamy instead in relation to English and American histories of race, enslavement, and the slave trade. The next part is called The Raced Body of Ella Peacock. Henry and Ella Peacock, whose surname suggests, of course, flamboyant color, each have lengthy introductions into the narrative of Dr. Wortle's School. However, the Englishman Mr. Peacock's physical description is only one line. Mr. Peacock was a small, wiry man, anything but robust in appearance, but still capable of great bodily exertion, right? And we know that because of his swimming heroism. And he's wonderful at cricket too, so Trollope loves him. We do not learn the color of Mr. Peacock's hair, his eyes, or his skin. In contrast, the description of Mrs. Peacock's person is quite detailed. This is from the novel. She was a woman something over 30 years of age when she first came to Bowick, in the very pride and bloom of woman's beauty. Her complexion was dark and brown, so much so that it was impossible to describe her color generally by any other word. But no clearer skin was ever given to a woman. Her eyes were brown, and her eyebrows black and perfectly regular. Her hair was dark and very glossy, and always dressed as simply as the nature of a woman's head will allow. Her features were regular, but with a great show of strength. She was tall for a woman, but without any of that look of length under which female altitude sometimes suffers. She was strong and well made, and apparently equal to any labor to which her position might subject her. The delineation of Mrs. Peacock insists upon the brownness of the woman's complexion, the darkness of her hair, and the strength of her body. The fact that Ella is tall for a woman also implies possible masculation, as does the robust frame that keeps her from delicate slenderness, from that look of length under which female altitude sometimes suffers. It is upon the woman's brown body that the race issues of Dr. Wortle's School are coded. Ella Beaufort is a Creole planter's daughter who comes of age in postbellum Louisiana. The histories of British and American slavery are entangled through centuries of the slave trade, not abolished in England until 1807, and the many years of transatlantic discourse that propelled the abolition of slavery in the British colonies in 1833 and the emancipation of American slaves on January 1st, 1863. The figure of the Creole codes not only a British West Indian colonial history of slavery, as in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, but also a larger European, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, Caribbean enslavement history, as well as the slaveholding history of the American South, focused upon the distinct racial history of Louisiana. One focus of Louisiana racial history is the figure of the Creole, and especially the Creole woman, who inspired both desire and fear. As Carolyn Villenga Berman argues in her book Creole Crossings, tracing a volatile trajectory, the Creole woman unleashes a kind of wildness in each text, unsettling and revising the boundaries of family and nation, along with the very concept of the domestic. Historically, the term Creole was always a locus not only of imperial colonial discourse, but also discourse about race, slavery, and blood that was concerned not only with European white Creole descent, but also with degrees of white and black blood. As Stephen Thernstrom states, Louisiana Creoles of color were the product of miscegenation in a seigneurial society and achieved elite status in Louisiana. And in the early 19th century, some Creoles were themselves slaveholders. Early 18th century laws in Jamaica and Barbados favoring mixed blood Creoles were influential in determining Louisiana laws that allowed Creoles privileged status over other mixed race or free black people. Creole sugarcane planters, primarily of French and Spanish descent, who fled the slave rebellion in the French colony of Saint Domingue, later Haiti, to Louisiana, brought along their black slaves, and also brought Les Serenes, their strikingly lovely mixed race mistresses, and the children of these unions. All of these free Creoles of color and their descendants formed an exclusive and endogamous society, Le Gens de Couleur Libre, that prided itself on its distinct culture, on French educations, on its patronage of the arts, and on its beautiful women. As Creole writer Alice Dunbar Nelson, wife of the poet Paul Dunbar, states about Creole people in the first half of the 19th century, the free people of color kept on amassing wealth and educating their children as ever, in spite of opposition. For it is difficult to enforce laws against a race when you cannot find that race. A distinctive, crucial feature of Creole culture in colonial and antebellum New Orleans was the institution of plissage, in which beautiful mixed race quadroon or octoroon women with pale skin and generally European phenotypes were placed with wealthy white Creole or visiting European men in what were called left handed marriages, mariage de la main gauche. The resulting liaisons, a form of concubinage that was respectable within the community of the free people of color, offered sex to the man and financial and bodily protection in addition to social standing to the woman. Some of these unions lasted until death. Although the white Creole man in these plissage relationships might leave his place upon marriage to a white woman, in practice, these illegal quasi-marriages were oftentimes bigamous, with the white man legally married to a white woman and begetting both legitimate and illegitimate children. Through the institution of plissage, the quadroon or octoroon Creole beauty could protect herself and her daughters from sexual violation and provide education, social mobility, and economic protection to all of her children, male and female. She could accumulate money and inherit property, which could be passed down to her children from the relationship with her white man. This colonial and antebellum institution broke down with the Civil War. In Trollope's Dr. Wortle's school, the brutal treatment of the apparently mixed race, dark Creole beauty Ella Beaufort Lefroy by a ruined plantation owner's white Creole son, the Spanish-French named Ferdinand Lefroy, may reference the breakdown of plissage in postbellum Louisiana. His implied physical and sexual abuse would signal the utter dissolution of plissage. The indeterminate, mysterious figure of the Creole woman was central to a white discourse of racialized desire and fear. The seminal mid-Victorian American literary precursors to Ella Peacock are the enslaved, mixed race Eliza, Cassie, and Emmeline in Harriet Beecher Stowe's best-selling abolitionist novel, the 1852 Uncle Tom's Cabin, often performed as a musical or play for 2 decades and more after its publication, and thus even more widely disseminated. The other most well-known high Victorian instance of what was called the tragic mulatta is the mixed-race beauty Zoe in Dion Bosco's play The Octoroon, or Life in Louisiana, 1859, which had been an enormous transatlantic success. Trollope, who loved theater, he wrote for the theater as well, as you probably know, not successfully. He would almost certainly have seen both productions and certainly have seen The Octoroon, since he had recently moved from Ireland to Waltham House on the outskirts of London. London audiences insisted upon Bosco changing the ending of the play to feature Zoe's marriage to her white cousin rather than her death, as on American stages. The narrator of Dr. Wortle's school tells us Ella Peacock's Creole story, a narrative of abuse and bondage. She was born Ella Beaufort, her French name suggesting her French Creole heritage, daughter of a ruined Louisiana planter who died when she was not yet 17. She is married off to the elder of the two sons of another ruined planter, General Lefroy, who had been rich in extent of acres and numbers of slaves before the War of the Secession. Both Colonel Ferdinand Lefroy, Ella's husband, whose first name suggests, as I said, Spanish Creole, and in his surname, French Creole heritage, and his younger brother, Colonel Robert Lefroy, are outlaws after the war ends. As Robert Tracy argues, the ideal of the Southern gentleman receives a debunking at Trollope's hands in his portrayal of the brutal, racist Lefroy brothers. Like his brother, the Southern gentleman, in quotation marks, Ferdinand Lefroy, is a volatile, abusive man. It is during his violent efforts to force his wife to accompany him on one of his forays with desperados, intent upon maintaining a perpetual war against the authorities of the United States or the borders of Texas, that Ella Lefroy is rescued by the Reverend Mr. Peacock and other respectable members of the community who have admired her singular beauty and dignified demeanor during the great scandal in the city as to the treatment which the wife received from her husband. Trollope's phrase, great scandal, all but narrates a domestic abuse so vicious it cannot be hidden from public scrutiny. In Ella's later words to Mrs. Wortle, what has happened to me has been so bad that I can hardly be injured further. He was always bad to me because he marred my early life, making it so foul a blotch that I hardly dare to look back upon it from the quietness and comparative purity of these latter days. He has so treated me that it has been a misfortune to me to be born. Trollope may intend us to understand that her brutal abuse has been not only physical and verbal, but sexual, and that as a result, she has been unable to reproduce. As far as we know in the novel, she has no children. The Peacocks find they cannot liberate themselves from the Louisiana past and its racial history by sailing to England. Once their story becomes known, the intense focus upon determining whether the first husband, Ferdinand Lefroy, is alive or dead may code an epistemological problem of quite another kind. How can you know whether you are white or black? When people with black ancestors pass every day for white, the knowledge of one's own ancestry becomes suspect. Henry Peacock's journey to the West with the doppelganger brother, Robert Lefroy, repeats a mission Peacock executed once before in another outlawed space, the borderlands between Texas and Mexico. He determined on that first journey that Ferdinand Lefroy was dead, yet Ferdinand Lefroy was still alive. Henry Peacock's continuing search for the dead husband, this time in the Wild West, may screen relentless fears of another kind. For Ella Beaufort's Creole identity is indeterminate. The obsession with racial purity that Creole identity throws into high relief, and the anxiety about miscegenation and racial contamination that underlies the figure of the Creole, is expressed in Trollope's portrayal of the disquiet that Ella generates among both Americans in Missouri and the English in Bowick Parish. In this coding as bigamy and marital disruption, Trollope's text enters recognizably British colonial discourse, in part by echoing Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Jane and Rochester's wedding is famously interrupted by Mason, the Creole wife Bertha's brother, and Jane is presented with the animal-like Bertha, Rochester's attic-dwelling mad wife. Jane then declares she will leave Rochester and will, quote, keep the law given by God, sanctioned by man. Trollope revises Bronte's text when the righteous Englishwoman, Jane, and the libidinous madwoman, Bertha, are transformed into one figure, the morally upright Creole beauty, Ella Peacock, whose dignity impresses all who come to know her. Trollope again rewrites Jane Eyre when Dr. Wortle explains the highly unusual conditions that might meliorate an illicit union and argue for the man and woman to cling together as husband and wife. As Dr. Wortle prepared to face all the world, confiding in the uprightness and humanity of his purpose, he states to himself in language that echoes Jane's famous speech, and these are Dr. Wortle's words. In such case, he must say something of this kind to all the world. I know they are not married. I know that their condition of life is opposed to the law of God and man. I know that she bears a name that is not in truth her own. But I think that the circumstances in this case are so strange, so peculiar, that they excuse a disregard even of the law of God and man. The underlying dread that is figured in the Peacock's illicit union is the fear of miscegenation. The Peacock's migration to England marks their effort to disguise their marriage's irregularity in what they hope is a more tolerant culture, one untainted by American enslavement and its obsession with racial purity that eventually led to the one drop of black blood laws in Louisiana, defining a person as black if that individual had any black blood. Trollope simultaneously writes an abolitionist fugitive slave narrative. It is disquieting that Ella spends most of the novel virtually imprisoned in the small classics master's house at Bowick School, while her husband travels all the way to California in search of proof of Ferdinand Lefroy's death. But this hiding place actually recalls Harriet, for instance, Harriet Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl and other slave narratives, which focus on finding a kind of hiding place, sometimes, as with Jacobs, one in which she stays for 7 years. For most of the novel, Ella is visited only by Geoffrey Wortle, although Mrs. Wortle overcomes her moral qualms and sees Ella as well after her husband is publicly criticized, Amo in the cool of the evening, one of the funniest passages, for harboring a beautiful fallen woman in whom he is assumed to be sexually interested. Dr. Wortle denies this accusation vigorously, insisting that all the world could have witnessed their meetings. However, as the narrator tells us, nevertheless, had all the world been present, he would not have held her hand so tenderly or so long as he had done on a certain occasion that had been mentioned. The next part is called The Dark Creole Beauty and the English Rose. The comic subplot to Dr. Wortle's school concerning young Mary Wortle and Lord Carstairs further helps to locate the race issues of the novel. Trollope scholars have ignored or commented only briefly on the novel's young love affair, but the quintessential Englishness of Mary Wortle and her identification with her handsome father are significant elements in this story of abuse and refuge. For Mary Wortle is an English rose who is first described in the month of June. It was said of her that of all the girls around, she was the prettiest, and indeed it would be hard to find a sweeter favored girl than Mary Wortle. Mary Wortle can most readily be viewed as a foil to the dark beauty Ella Peacock. The issue that divides Mary Wortle and Lord Carstairs is one of social class rather than race. It is even more precisely one of rank rather than of class, since Mary Wortle's father is a wealthy and well-educated clergyman and an influential gentleman, while Carstairs' father is an earl. And in fact, Lord Carstairs, the earl, finally says, "At any rate, the doctor is a gentleman," the earl said, comforting himself. Right? However, the relative ease and alacrity with which young Carstairs is allowed to engage himself to Mary, despite the differences between them, is a counter to the lengthy trauma suffered by Ella and Henry Peacock. The plots of the novel are in tension as the Peacock secret is revealed and their suffering continues, while Mary and Carstairs are entirely open about their desire, especially, of course, Carstairs, which begins with his bold request, "I have come here to ask if you can love me." Mary is readily accepted by Earl Bracy and the Countess. The Earl gives Mary a beautiful brooch, which signifies, says the Countess to Mary, that he looks upon you as his daughter. The tension between an eventual intertwining of the plots is emphasized by Lord Carstairs' special friendship with Henry Peacock, who is his classics tutor and a mentor to the young lord. After the Peacocks' remarriage in London at the end of the novel, Carstairs comes to see Mary at Bowick School, and then the narrator says, "So necessary was it for him to renew his intimacy with Mr. Peacock," as the narrator dryly comments, since of course he's just come to see Mary. The last part is called Dr. Geoffrey Wortle and Anthony Trollope. It is perhaps the force of Geoffrey Wortle's character that has overshadowed other issues, including the narrative's engagement with race. The novel begins with the sentence, "The Reverend Geoffrey Wortle, D.D., was a man much esteemed by others and by himself." The novel focuses upon this pugnacious, intelligent, autocratic middle-aged man as his defense of the Peacocks begins to cause the demise of his cherished Bowick School. The narrator tells us that Dr. Wortle knew his own mind so well as to justify him in repudiating counsel from others. He liked to be master and always was. He was just and liked his justice to be recognized. He was generous also and liked that too to be known. Geoffrey Wortle has worked hard for his success and has, and this is a quote from the novel again, resolved that though it became him as a man to work for his bread, his wife should not be a slave. In great contrast to Ferdinand Lefroy's brutal treatment of his miserable wife, Dr. Wortle's wife is as happy a woman as you shall be likely to meet on a summer's day. Geoffrey Wortle is a man who would bear censure from no human being, a trait that has engendered many battles with 3 successive bishops. Dr. Wortle is the perfect antagonist to a prejudiced society and to the dissolute, violent Lefroy brothers. Although he is masterful, Geoffrey Wortle is also fair-minded and generous, as well as rebellious in standing up against established authority for what he thinks is right. Trollope's older son, Henry, wrote to Michael Sadleir in 1923 of being struck in reading Dr. Wortle's school with a likeness, not on all fours, between the doctor and my father. As Mick Imla states, this would give Dr. Wortle's school a special place in Trollope's oeuvre. There is nothing much like self-portraiture in all the fiction that had gone before. I actually don't agree with that. I mean, all of us just read The Vicar of Bullemton, right? And we have, I think we have Frank Fennick as someone who's quite a lot like Trollope, um, very pugnacious. And as one of his friends said, "Oh, Trollope turns my umbrella inside out," right, with his energy. Finally, this is a very short critique. We can talk about it a lot later of the Western adventure, and then just a brief conclusion. Um, so, the critique of the American Western male bonding adventure. Right? The American scenes of the novel rupture its English domestic realism. Here we might recall Carolyn Berman's caution in Creole Crossings that the Creole woman unleashes a kind of wildness in each text, unsettling and revising the boundaries of family and nation, along with the very concept of the domestic. Henry Peacock's journey to San Francisco with Robert Lefroy in order to ascertain Ferdinand Lefroy's death and thus Ella's freedom to marry is just such a kind of wildness in Dr. Wortle's school. And yet, this is a strange, understated kind of wild Western adventure. Trollope imagines his journey of two enemies as the opposite of the American homosocial bonding tale, right? As if to interrogate the significance and costs of that male contract to many women, including Ella Peacock. In this adventure tale, there is no comradeship, but rather a dangerous connection based for Lefroy upon avarice and revenge, and for Peacock upon his love for Ella. Through Henry Peacock's arduous journey with the vicious Southerner Lefroy, perhaps there is a recognition of inescapable English complicity in the criminality of American enslavement. In Peacock's resilient faith, there is a kind of redemption as he returns with the evidence that will allow Ella the freedom to leave her carceral state and become his wife in the eyes of church and state, as well as in her own eyes and Henry's. Right? And we might add, and Jeffrey Wortles. This is the conclusion. It is likely that Trollope was influenced in writing the story of a Louisiana born Creole woman by his relationships with writers and thinkers who were abolitionists, such as his close friend Charles Buxton, son of the great abolitionist Thomas Full Buxton, and the second chair after John Stuart Mill of the committee that formed to prosecute Governor Eyre after the Jamaica Rebellion. Preeminent among these intellectuals and writers is Trollope's own mother, Fanny Trollope, whose Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw, a novel of 1836, vividly depicted the outrages of American slavery nearly 2 decades before Uncle Tom's Cabin. In this anti slavery novel, the beautiful quadroon Selina, the tragic mulatta, commits suicide when she learns of her racial heritage. Among Anthony Trollope's family and friends, as well as in his liberal political party, anti slavery discourses had long been familiar, and the legacy of colonial slavery was clearly still revealing itself. Again, as Jennifer Brody reminds us, the mulattoon has been marginalized in Victorian discourse, past and present, in part because her own overtly hybrid roots recall the miscegenated borders of the culture itself. Her appearance comments on the illegitimate, in quotes, sources of English wealth and the unseemly origins of English imperial power, bringing her formerly excluded narrative to the fore, centering her for a moment, remembers the always already hybrid origins of the English nation. In Dr. Wortle's School, written toward the end of Trollope's long and productive life, he made what turned out to be his last foray into the race discourses that had so long engaged many of the other great writers of his generation, and I might say had also engaged him in a number of novels, most prominently, and he knew he was right. By doing so, Trollope laid claim to the dark history of enslavement in America, in the colonies, and in England itself as an essential part of English identity. Trollope brings the Creole's formerly excluded narrative to the fore, and thereby once again educates us all in the school of his great fiction. Thank you.